Welcome to Passages Pulse, where we track the heartbeat of Israel and the Middle East from a Christian perspective. In a time of confusion, division, and misinformation, we're here to help you cut through the noise with truth, clarity, and conviction.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Passages Pulse. Before we get started, let me ask you a quick question. What is a Christian Zionist really? Do you ever feel like you're pressured to defend or explain that label? Or do you even choose to accept that label or embrace the label? These are really important questions. At the time we're recording this episode, it is 11 a.m. Eastern on July 30th, 2025. My name is Josiah McGee. Sebastian, your usual host, is taking a week off of his hosting duties, so I'm here in his place and happy to be hosting our good friend Serene Hudson. Before we jump in, just a brief introduction for Serene. Serene made her first trip to Israel in the year 2000, which was the start of a lifelong connection to Israel and the Jewish people. Her educational background includes an MA in Intercultural Studies and a recently completed Master of Arts in Jewish Studies at the Spertus Institute. Serene also worked for Passages for several years, and in 2023, she began serving the wider field of Israel educational travel through a role at the Jewish Federations of North America. Currently, Serene is learning the ropes of homeschooling her children while teaching as an adjunct instructor in the Jewish Studies Department at Moody Bible Institute and building a consulting practice in Jewish-Christian relations. On a more personal note as well, Serene was also my boss for a time while she was at Passages. I'm thrilled that we finally have the opportunity to have an on-record conversation, a version of the many off-record conversations that we've had when I was working for you. And I also do want to note for listeners that Serene is a faithful Christian who prioritizes her faith in the Lord Jesus and trust-based Jewish-Christian relations from that perspective. So that's a bit about Serene. Welcome, Serene. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Josiah. It's really great to be with you.
We're very glad that you're here. I also want to give the audience just a real quick primer for why we're having this conversation, what led us to reach out to you and schedule this conversation. There's two big things happening right now. And some of it is a little bit behind the scenes. Some of it's very front of mind in the headlines right now. So we'll start with the first. First reason for this conversation is that there's been a growing number of Christians actually recently who are writing pieces arguing that really they're sort of these hit pieces on Christian Zionism, arguing that Christian Zionists are incapable of criticizing Israel, that they will excuse anything that Israel does and cast any criticism of Israel as anti-Semitism, and that in fact Christian Zionists will do so to the degree that they glorify and celebrate violence. So, pretty serious accusations and caricatures, I think, of Christian Zionism. We definitely want to have a pretty serious conversation about that. Is it actually what Christian Zionism is? The second thing is that the humanitarian situation in Gaza appears to have taken a turn for the worse. I'll just throw up a picture here for our viewers who are on YouTube so that you can see a bit of what is in the headlines right now. Of course, many pictures like this. This is actually one of the nicer images. There's some worse images floating around right now, some of which have been discredited as belonging to victims of other illnesses or conditions, not actually suffering from malnutrition, but something else. But it's undeniable, of course, that there are, in fact, cases of malnutrition in the Gaza Strip, and they're growing very quickly, the number of these cases. During the ceasefire earlier this year, the cases of malnutrition and food shortages improved significantly. This was the ceasefire that happened early this year, the first couple of months. And then from March to May, roughly, there was a pause in humanitarian aid to the Gaza Strip, which then resumed after a couple of months of no humanitarian aid to the Gaza Strip. According to the Times of Israel last week, since the end of that ceasefire in March, malnutrition cases significantly increased. Food shortages have also increased as well. Food prices have gone up 1,400%. So inflation is just rampant in the Gaza Strip right now. And basically what's happening is that Israel and the UN are both playing this blame game for lack of effective food and aid distribution. Obviously, the collective response to pictures like this is horror. I mean, this is just a horrifying image of a young child who's innocent, has done nothing wrong, but is suffering the consequences of this war being fought. And again, it's sort of raising the question around the same time that Christian Zionists are coming under some heat for the support of Israel, is raising questions about how do Christian Zionists respond to this image and other controversies about Israel right now. So we're here to just try to make a little bit of sense out of that situation. I'm afraid that's going to be a rather tall order, but we're going to try. Ian's here to help me out. And a couple questions that we just want to ask Serene and get some feedback, get some input. Who are Christian Zionists really? How should Christian Zionists respond to these controversies about Israel? What is the line between anti-Semitism and constructive criticism? And we're going to dive into all that. So let's go ahead and get started. Serene, last week we had a listener who sent in, I think, a really great question, actually. I think it was a response to an Instagram poll. So for our listeners, if you want to give input on what you want discussed during these episodes, do be on the lookout for some of those polls. But one of the questions we got basically was, should Christians embrace the term Zionist? Or is this a term that isn't really meant for Christians? Is Christian Zionist something we should actually strive to be? I think that's an interesting question, a fair question. So I would ask Serene, maybe before you tackle that question, can you just maybe define terms a little bit? What is a Christian Zionist?
Sure. I think we should start with Zionist first, because sometimes that also is a complicated answer. So, from my perspective, a Zionist is somebody that affirms the belief that the Jewish people have come from somewhere and that they have an ancestral homeland. And the Jewish people, having been exiled for 2 millennia, always longed to return there. And Zionism as a movement came forward more in the political sphere in the modern period. And so there were Jews all around the world, and specifically in Eastern Europe, who were making movements towards escaping some of the violence and returning to the land of Israel, which was then Ottoman Palestine. So that is Zionism historically. Christian Zionism is an affirmation of that belief and a support of that movement by people who call themselves followers of Jesus. Now, the reasons for that stance can be multifaceted, from theological viewpoints, from political viewpoints, from viewpoints of our connection to the Jewish people and to Judaism. And I think that is where we start to work through the issue of Christian Zionism being portrayed in broad strokes or essentialized to saying this is what Christian Zionism really is, when really what I want to say is there are many different kinds of reasons and expressions of Christian Zionism. So if I believed that Christian Zionism was, this stance from a biblical perspective that the modern state of Israel is perfect and can do whatever it wants, I would say, no, I wouldn't embrace that. But because I don't think it's that one thing, I do embrace it. I think that Christians have the freedom to take that and kind of feel comfortable to stand with the Jewish people and with Israel without having to carry all of the negative instances that they might not agree with other Christian Zionists, or even negative portrayals that kind of get attached to it.
So this is making a lot of sense to me. I just want to summarize and make sure that it's actually making sense to me and I'm hearing you correctly. Christian Zionism is a couple of things. One, it's very diverse, religiously, politically.
Yes.
It's not a monolithic movement necessarily. There's different reasons why people support Israel and its existence. At its core, basically, it's support for Israel's right to exist as Christians. That is essentially the basis of Christian Zionism. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it is support for every one of Israel's actions. Is that
correct?
A fair summary?
That's right. And when we say Israel, we mean Israeli government.
Right. The modern state of Israel. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. That makes sense. So one of the things I think that also comes up a lot in relation to this question is this sort of accusation, if you will, that Christian Zionists tend to blur the line, perhaps even intentionally so, between anti-Semitism and constructive criticism of Israel, and to argue that either you can't tell the difference or that there is no difference between anti-Semitism, constructive criticism. So some Christian Zionists would never criticize Israel, essentially. Is there, do you think, a difference between the two? Can you maybe provide us a definition of anti-Semitism that helps understand that difference? And is there a litmus test that helps understand what are the differences between the two?
Yeah, so anti-Semitism is any kind of hostility or discrimination towards the Jewish people as a people group, as a religion, as a nationality. And there is something that goes deeper as it relates to perception of the Jewish people, right? It's like there's something that is negative, something that is hostile, and wishes to kind of put them in a box and say this is who they are and there's something wrong with that with that people group or identity. And that is different than being able to recognize that in Israel as a country, as a society, as a government, there are problems, right? There are ways to experience those problems, to see those problems, to talk about those problems that are not anti-Jewish. So I think that sometimes it's easier to think about it in the three categories that Josiah, you and I actually had talked about, which is it can easily cross into anti-Semitism when, for example, you demonize the Jewish people. And demonizing means painting Israel or the Jewish people in terms that make them out to be kind of evil in themselves. And that is rooted in some very typical anti-Semitic tropes, especially from the medieval period. So I think that having a good grasp on the history of anti-Semitism, and specifically for our audience, the history of Christian anti-Semitism, helps us to discern when there is criticism of Israel, when does that cross over into an anti-Semitic leaning trope. And even if it's not intended, how can we be sensitive to when it starts to lean in that direction and push people in the direction of perceptions of Jewish people that come from anti-Semitism? So, for example, in the medieval period, there were accusations that Jewish people would kidnap a Christian child and kill them and use their blood to make Passover matzah, which is an atrocious accusation, and we call that the blood libel. How are blood libels utilized today? Or how is criticism of Israel kind of leaning in the direction of just some atrocious accusations that are untrue, unfounded, and pushing us in that direction, which supports this conception of demonizing Jewish people? So I think for me, the way that I have kind of watched that and assess things is really, it's from a historical lens, and it comes from knowing what kinds of tropes have been promoted about the Jewish people. Another quick example is stemming from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was a forgery in Russia, that there was this secret cabal of Jewish leaders that got together to talk about how to take over the world, and has to do with Jewish control and money. And when I look at criticisms of Israel, do I hear instances or echoes of that trope? And so I think it does take a bit of educating ourselves of historical expressions of anti-Semitism, and then pairing that with an understanding of how the Jewish people, Jewish communities hear those things, and it's in light of what has been said of them in the past. And not just that it's an accusation, but those accusations lead to some devastating consequences and threats for them as people.
Yeah. I think to just respond to a couple of things that you said and give their listeners something to think about, when Serene brings up something like the blood libel, for example, it might be hard to imagine something that graphic or horrific actually being a part of the discourse today. But if you go to example, let's just think about some of the hostage release ceremonies that Hamas was holding, being publicized around the world. What was on some of those posters was an image of the prime minister of the state of Israel as a vampire, essentially. I mean, it's not subtle at all. It's actually front and center, part of the modern discourse today, this idea that Israel is this bloodthirsty vampire that's sucking the life out of the rest of the world for its own purposes or whatever. It's horrible, it's anti-Semitic, but it is something that you do actually see even today. I also wanted to note, Serene, I think something that's really interesting about a lot of the dialogue about Israel, and can we criticize it? Can we not? And one of the things that stands out to me is that it's true. I don't want to deny the fact that a lot of Christian Zionists that I speak to are reluctant to criticize Israel because they don't want to even unintentionally say something that might be anti-Semitic. So the complexity that is involved is definitely a part of that hesitancy and that difficulty of trying to figure out how to express even healthy criticism of Israel. Something else that stands out to me is that there is a lot of general confusion, even beyond the role of anti-Semitism in criticism of Israel. The pace at which we get information right now the
Right.
pace of misinformation, the pace of news articles or news agencies updating their articles, sometimes with just these tiny little footnotes at the bottom, so you barely even notice that they've had to correct some of their reporting. It's really difficult. I mean, the New York Times just, I think yesterday, published an update basically saying that one of the photos they shared of a child in Gaza who was supposed to be this poster child for starvation there was actually a muscular dystrophy case, essentially. So this story had been misreported as evidence of this famine in Gaza. And what's really unfortunate is that it's true that people are suffering in Gaza, but the fact that this story had to be corrected just plants a little seed of doubt. It makes it that much harder for people to trust the news sources that they're reading, trust the information they're getting, and it leaves you wondering, what do I actually believe? What's true? What's not? What's credible? And that is also going to, I think, plant just a little seed of hesitancy about, I want to engage. I want to just kind of sit back and not say anything because I'm not actually sure that I know what's true and what's not, and I don't want to say the wrong thing. That's a big part of what's happening right now. And you also have the introduction, of course, of exaggerated terms like genocide, for example.
Right.
I'm just going to put my cards on the table. Some listeners will appreciate this, some won't. I don't think a genocide is happening in Gaza. That doesn't mean that there is not a tremendous scale of human suffering in Gaza. But it does make it very difficult to have conversations when you're trying to thread a very fine needle and basically argue that the suffering that does exist is not genocide, but is still a form of human suffering that needs to be addressed. And that's just a very difficult conversation to have. These are not excuses for Christian Zionism and the reluctance at times to speak up when it maybe should be engaging in some healthy criticism of Israel. But they are complicating factors that just make it exponentially more difficult to have a constructive dialogue, I think, about some of these issues. So I just wanted to throw that out there as something else that I've observed in addition to this conversation about anti-Semitism. Serene, I think it would be great if we unpacked some examples for people. I just gave the one about the vampire poster. It's just wild. I still just can't believe it when I see that online. The humanitarian situation, it's in the news right now. Everyone's paying attention to it. So I think it's a really great example to talk about what does this mean practically. It's easy to say the right thing on a podcast when you're speaking in abstract theoretical terms, but when it comes to real life, I just said, it gets a little bit more complicated. So I want to see if we can unpack an example and help the audience think through how this meets real life, I suppose. So if you wouldn't mind, let's take a look at both sides of this. What would be examples of anti-Semitic responses to some real world headlines, and then examples of maybe some constructive responses to those headlines. The humanitarian situation in Gaza right now, I already laid out. Would you mind maybe sharing what your mind would be anti-Semitic responses to how bad the humanitarian situation has gotten in Gaza?
Well, I'm actually glad that you brought up an example of the blood libel as imagery, because perceptions of the Jewish people that are anti-Semitic have been captured and promoted through imagery. So if you take that example that you gave of the prime minister drawn as a vampire with the blood streaming down, to past images that were anti-Semitic tropes of that bloodthirsty Jewish person, you can then think about it in terms of how do we react to a report about the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, dealing with the humanitarian crisis. And if there's this immediate gut reaction to oh, of course they're, because there's this evil negative intent towards people that live in Gaza, we are going to assume immediately that of course they're holding back aid. When really the response should be, let's try to find out more information about this. So in the case of preparing for this conversation between the two of us, we were following the story very closely. And it was a very good exercise that reminded me that you hear the story, you see it come out, hit the headlines, and then you give it time to develop and for more information to come out and for perspectives to be expressed. And the way that I think about this is I remember my friends who live in Israel. I remember that Israeli society has long been committed to a conversation and to peace with their neighbors. right? Instead of what feels like knee-jerk reactions on social media or on mainstream media that portrays Israelis as this one thing, which is genocidal, which is oppressive. And that's where it gets to be kind of fine distinctions. And what's difficult is you cannot determine what is in a person's heart, but you can observe your own heart. You can observe maybe what people are saying. And can we listen to the underlying narrative there or the underlying presuppositions? Can we, and many of our listeners I know are Passages alumni, can we bring into our conversations the experience of meeting Jewish people, of meeting those that live in Israel, even the Arab people, Palestinians that we met along the way, those that actually lived through these very difficult times, and say, listen, the intent is not to destroy life. The intent is to actually preserve life, Jewish and other. How can we bring that? That perspective is not in a lot of conversations, right? So I think it's really important for those of us who have been there. And if you haven't been there and you have experience of friendships with Jewish people, how can we humanize them? How can we bring the humanity into these conversations and not just go off of what we're seeing on the media? I think it is so important to bring our voice, and it doesn't have to follow talking points, right? It can follow what we understand from being much more aware and much more patient with the news stories. And we can bring love and respect and care for life that is so hard to find in the external conversations. Sometimes this happens on socials, but I think the powerful conversations are the personal ones. We're dialoguing with people and we're trying to show that as Christians, we will be different at this conversation. We will give it a little bit more time. We'll be discerning, and we'll bring perspectives that have to do with loving people and other fruit of the Holy Spirit.
So it sounds like what you're saying is an anti-Semitic response to the terrible photos, the headlines that you're reading right now, would be something like assuming the worst, assuming
That's
ill
right.
intent, and not taking time to think critically about what's not being said or what's not being spoken in the story that's being told. And that makes sense. I think Christians, to your point, should be discerning and loving. I think we've had some conversations, Serene, about my own take or perspective on how we react to some of the more sensationalist headlines, like accusations of genocide, for example. I think it's, to put it in different terms, and I guess in my own terminology, the same thing that you're saying is my impression is that we need to be better as Christians about thinking with both the logic and the compassion side of your brain. Because you have two parts to your brain, essentially. Everyone does. It's part of what makes you human. The ability to feel and to reason, and to do so simultaneously, and to hold those two parts of your being in tension. And I think it's something that we are losing in many cases, the ability to do both at the same time. And that is a slippery slope sometimes that winds up getting you places where you don't want to be. I do want to make another observation about where this sometimes goes, or an example of how we do kind of fall down this slippery slope. One thing that I'll hear spoken fairly frequently that I think is problematic, and again, it's to your point as well, we don't know the hearts of man, so I don't necessarily want to go as far as saying, that's anti-Semitic, but I think it's, we'll call it a poor or problematic response to the situation, is when you read the headlines, you internalize what you're being told, and then you assume that it's because Israel has just given up on Gaza, that Israel is doing nothing to help the civilians of Gaza. It's intentionally starving all of them. And that's not necessarily true. The reality is something more like Israel is doing something, and the argument shouldn't be whether Israel is doing something. Whether it's doing the right thing is another matter entirely. And we'll get to that in a moment as a matter of where constructive critique does begin to find its place, I think. But I just want to point out for the audience, I mean, one of the things that you'll hear all the time is, well, Israel's doing absolutely nothing to help these people. And that's not true. I mean, it doesn't mean that they're doing the right thing, but they are doing something. So I'll throw up another picture here just as a quick visual of some of the dialogue that's been coming out of Israel in response to these accusations of intentionally starving Gazans. Israel's pointed out the fact that, well, no, there's hundreds of trucks of humanitarian aid on the Gaza side of the border that have been let into Gaza, uncollected by different agencies that are supposed to be distributing it. A lot of it just winding up in piles that look like a trash heap at this point because it's been there so long. So there's something being done. Doesn't mean it's the right thing, but there is something being done. There are existing humanitarian corridors where this is supposed to be transported from the border to a distribution site. There are, since a lot of the controversy really surfaced in the last week or so, even new humanitarian corridors opened, which is a good thing. Maybe it should have happened sooner, but it's a good thing that it is opening up. You also have many examples of Israel trying to find a way to solve the distribution problem. I mean, Israel's big thing to this point has been they don't want Hamas involved in distribution, but they have tried to find other ways like the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. So to argue that they're not doing anything is, I think, disingenuous, and it's not really helpful. And as Christians, we have to be able to dig a little bit deeper and recognize that that's not a very genuine argument. That's a disingenuous argument. It's not entirely based in reality.
Right.
At the same time, that doesn't mean that everything's fine.
Right.
And there is still some room for constructive critique. We just have to work a little bit harder, I think, to get there and to think both rationally and compassionately about the situation. So those are my thoughts. Yes, exactly. Serene, before we talk about some of those constructive critiques, is there anything else that you want to add on this point?
Yeah, I mean, I look at this picture and it's heartrending because these supplies need to get to people that are in need of them. And there are so many challenges that Israel faces to safely distribute, effectively support the people of Gaza. And as a Christian who supports the Jewish people and Israel, Christian Zionist, I see that this is a problem. And I do believe Israel is trying to do the right things. There are innumerable challenges to getting this aid, and much of it is safety concerns and keeping it out of the hands of Hamas. So I think that my own connection to people that are working on these issues helps me to understand that this is complicated and the intention for help is there. I think that would be another response to those of us who want to be involved, draw nearer to more people and to more perspectives and voices that are working to get this aid over.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. Something I also want to highlight for everyone in case you missed some of the previous episodes earlier this season. We did an episode talking about the unfortunate, tragic, really the murder of Yaron and Sarah, who were two employees at the Israeli embassy, killed in Washington, D.C. early this year in an anti-Semitic attack. And it was, I think, tragically ironic that the reason why they were there at this Jewish museum in D.C. in the first place was for a meeting, a young diplomat's reception to discuss issues like humanitarian aid into Gaza, how to increase the effective flow and distribution of humanitarian aid in Gaza. So clearly there are people in Israel who really deeply care about this, are deeply passionate about this, and are trying to problem solve. To ignore that would, I think, be, again, I'll use the word problematic.
Yes.
It's not a good response to the situation. That being said, I think, one of the things we do want to offer our listeners during this conversation is we don't want to just dismiss outright all of the misplaced criticisms of Israel, but offering an alternative that is a bit more constructive, so we understand that there is a way to engage in healthy criticism. An outlet like that, I think, is necessary in moments like this. So I'm just going to give a couple of examples of what are some things that maybe we could discuss briefly. Number one, I think, is not a black and white issue, and I'm not going to come down solidly one way or the other on this in this conversation. I think it's worth putting on the table just so people are aware of this, that even inside Israel, there is a debate about whether or not it was a good idea to stop humanitarian aid between the months of March and May. The idea was, while Hamas is stealing it, we need time to build alternative mechanisms so that Hamas can't just keep stealing this humanitarian aid and using it for their own purposes. So we're going to stop it until we feel like there is an alternative in place. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation And at the time, there was, supposedly 4 to 6 months of humanitarian aid stored in the Gaza Strip. So it didn't seem like it was going to be a big deal. Now in Israel, you'll hear people arguing, well, yes and no, because that might have contributed to the massive inflation of food prices. Even though there was months worth of food available, it's still a finite supply in economics that's going to have a negative impact on the food supply chain. It's an interesting debate. I think, again, I'm not going to take one side or the other in this conversation, but I think it is something that if you want to really go deep into the strategic layers of how this war is being fought, you could have an interesting conversation about that. Something that I think is a little bit more clear, and I'm noticing even in Israel, there's a bit more consensus now, is that one thing that Israel has not failed to do is let humanitarian aid in recently, I should say. What it has, at this point, again, even in Israel, there's some consensus to this point. What it has essentially failed to do is secure the humanitarian aid distribution sites. And this is a problem. I think there's this blame game that goes around between Israel and the UN. And I think there's plenty of blame to go around both sides. They both bear some responsibility. But I think Israel at this point, just speaks some hard truths about the situation right now. It controls up to 75% of the Gaza Strip. Okay. It's responsible for what happens in those 75% of the Gaza Strip. It is. I mean, it is the power with the ability to exercise use of force in that area of the Gaza Strip, and it is essentially responsible for what happens there, for order and security in those areas. It's also intentionally trying to cut Hamas out of the process of distributing humanitarian aid, which is fine because there are very good arguments to do so. But if Israel wants to do so, yes, that means that it is effectively assuming more responsibility than it otherwise might have for what happens to people and their access to humanitarian aid if you're intentionally cutting other people out of the process. What does that mean? Well, it means that I think Israel recognizes and is even recently owning up to the fact that it has a responsibility to make sure that access to the humanitarian aid is safe, and it hasn't met that obligation effectively. You still have cases in which the humanitarian aid is being stolen by members of Hamas and it's not getting to the right people. You still have cases in which people trying to approach Gaza Humanitarian Foundation sites are being, unfortunately, killed. And sometimes that's members of Hamas trying to prevent them from reaching the site and limit the influence that the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation has. Sometimes that's the IDF shooting at people because, you have thousands of people approaching a site. I'll just throw another picture up just so you can see a little bit of the scale. There was a reporting or story came out, I think yesterday, the day before the Call Me Back podcast. Someone was describing the situation as, imagine you have 5 to 10 young people or even reservists with families manning an outpost, and suddenly you see 1,000 Palestinians coming towards you, most of which are males, not all military age, but predominantly male. So most of them assumed that they could be fighting age, and you're not really equipped to deal with that. And that is essentially, I think, the first person I heard really make a compelling case that this is something that Israel has to deal with was actually an Israeli journalist, Aviv Gur, who argued this is a strategic failure. It is. For Israel to put soldiers in a position where they're vastly outnumbered, they are not retrained on how to do crowd control after spending the vast majority of their time in Gaza doing things like clearing buildings and hunting for terrorists. They haven't been effectively retrained for crowd control. They haven't been effectively re-equipped for crowd control. They're still using their rifles. They're still being given live ammunition. They're not being given things like rubber bullets or other non-lethal crowd control measures. And that's just putting them in a position where things are going to happen. Like bad things are going to happen when you're not put in a position to succeed. So for me, I think this is an example where it does seem like, okay, we can offer some constructive critiques. This doesn't mean that Israel is intentionally starving all Palestinians. It doesn't mean that Israel is evil. It does not mean that Israel is conducting a genocide. It means that there are tactical and strategic errors that have been made by the IDF, errors that they themselves are owning up to. There are investigations. There are changes being made to the way people are being trained and all sorts of things happening in response to this to try to fix this. But this is kind of like the low-hanging fruit, where if you're trying to understand, as a Christian Zionist, how do I engage in some healthy dialogue about how we got into this mess, some healthy criticism, I think this is a good place to start as saying, yeah, even Israel knows that it messed up. And we can admit that as Christian Zionists, that this is a problem that needs to be fixed. So Serene, I would love maybe your reaction to that is that fair? Have I said anything that's unfair to Israel or the situation? Is there anything you would push back on, or any feedback that you want to offer?
Well, I want to actually rewind and go back to what you said about the two diplomats that were murdered in an anti-Semitic incident in Washington, D.C. So if you think about them and their commitment to bringing humanitarian aid to Gaza to ease the human suffering there, they suffered from the promotion of anti-Jewish rhetoric and anti-Semitism here in the United States. And that caused the help that was coming towards Gazan people to be thwarted in a way, right? So you think about how constructive criticism versus anti-Semitism and the devastating effects of that, it's not just hurting Jewish people in America, Israelis, Jews all over the world, but it's also actually hurting the very people that need the help, right? The Gazans. And when we can come at this from a constructive perspective, saying, hey, there's something really wrong happening with this aid distribution. Can we talk about how to improve that situation? For me, the way I think about it is let's try to remove the obstacles of Israel in getting that aid to the people. And that goes to my understanding of Hamas being the major obstacle to this. Why is it that the nations of the world that have influence still allow Hamas to exist as a terrorist entity? Why is it that Israel is still being portrayed as the aggressors intent on genocide when it's really Hamas that has created all of this suffering for their own people? Let's be constructive about this. Let's think about Israel in a different light, meaning let's just stop constantly trying to delegitimize the country, right? And let's try to support the efforts by removing some of those obstacles to getting aid to those who really need it. And obviously, as individuals and as normal citizens, we might not have access to, people that can affect that change, but we can speak up. We can be a force for good as Christian Zionists, call into account our own government, our own elected officials, and saying, like, can we please support the actual getting of that aid and remove the obstacles, remove the challenges? Can we not say that it's only Israel that's at fault here? And I so want to see the actual solutions to the problem and kind of come out of this cycle of blame and remove those obstacles. Give Israel the chance that it deserves to actually care for this humanitarian problem and stop the blame. I think that's kind of where I would feel it's constructive. There's criticism. Yes, there's a problem. There's been mistakes. There's been mishandling of this aid operation. But let's also look at the crisis of the challenges and still giving Hamas any kind of footholds. It's already been proven that they have embedded themselves in civilian areas in order to cause more suffering and death. Why do we allow them to continue to do that? And to me, it has to do with changing the perception, again, walking away from Israel being intent on this evil that they are constantly accused of, to perceiving them in a different light and saying, okay, how can we support this effort and really find a solution to the problem?
I think it's a really good point that you're driving home, Serene, that constructive criticism or constructive dialogue is a few things. One, it's very specific. It's not generalized, it's specific. And I think that's something that we miss the boat on fairly frequently. Two, it takes into account the good and the bad. So it doesn't whitewash the problem, but it also doesn't assign all of the blame for the problem on any one party or negate any of the good that they're trying to do to address that problem.
That's right.
And it's solution oriented. I would say those are our big three for what does constructive criticism or dialogue look like about the problems that Israel faces. It's specific. It is going to take into account the good and the bad, and it's going to be solution oriented. I think those are all really good things for us to remember. I don't want to go down a rabbit trail and get into the weeds on something, but I just want to remind the listeners that part of what makes this so complicated, people ask, like, well, why hasn't Israel just uprooted Hamas from these different areas? If it really cares that much about Hamas not being part of the solution, why is Hamas still there after 2 years of fighting? It's really the hostages. I mean, the big debate that's been happening in Israeli society for almost 2 years now is what's more important, destroying Hamas or getting the hostages back? Because it's never been clear since day one of this war, since October 7, it hasn't been clear that you would be able to actually accomplish both. And it's been, I wouldn't say totally clear, but it's definitely seemed more likely that eventually Israel would have to make a choice between the two. That's a very difficult choice to make, and that's part of why this war has dragged on as long as it has, and why it's so complicated. Serene, we close every episode by asking ourselves and any guests that we have, how can we be praying about this? Because I think as Christians, that is important. We bring this conversation back to the Lord in prayer. So do you have any suggestions on things that you think would be especially important for us to be praying about?
I think we should be praying for ourselves to have discernment and wisdom. We are not at this alone. Jesus said, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. And it says in Proverbs that your word is a lamp unto my feet and a light for my path. So I think that a key prayer focus is for discernment and praying for wisdom with the hope that he promised those who ask for wisdom will be given wisdom, right? And so in this time of heightened anti-Semitism, lots of confusion and lots of polarization, as believers, we need to be praying for discernment, for wisdom, and anchoring that prayer in the hope of Jesus, the hope of the gospel that he will give us the light. And then from there, praying for opportunities to lovingly and responsively engaging with people and pushing back on the darkness. So we pray for ourselves and we pray for opportunities to talk about this, and really that we will be anchored in this time and do what is right. There's so many other ways that we can pray. We can pray for our leaders. We can pray for everyone that's involved. We can pray for a solution to the humanitarian crisis. We can pray for the light of the gospel to bring change to human hearts. These are the things that I pray for. And always do believe, though, that it starts with us. It starts with us being changed. It starts with us being led by the Spirit.
Yeah, I don't know that I have much to add in terms of how to pray, because those are all very good things to be praying for. I think for me personally, it's a combination of mercy and justice. For God's mercy, that there would be an end to the human suffering, which is incredibly high at this point, and justice. We want to see an end to the conflict that actually results in a sense of justice, a defeat of evil, lasting peace. So those are the things that I pray for, in addition to everything you mentioned, Serene. I want to thank everyone for joining us this week. Thank you, Serene, for being here. It's been a real pleasure. Again, I'm so glad we could do this and actually record this conversation, because we've had many of these chats to the side over the years.
Yes.
Thank you to Lindsay and Avery, our production team, for supporting us as well. Thank you, Sebastian, for resting this week. Look forward to having you back next week, rested and ready to go again. And we will look forward to being with all of our audience again next week. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Josiah.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Passages Pulse. Help us grow this community by liking, sharing, and subscribing. If you like this week's episode, let us know by leaving a comment below. This podcast is a project of Passages Israel. We exist to educate the next generation of Christians on modern Israel, deepen the roots of their faith, and equip leaders to foster positive Christian engagement with Israel and the Jewish people. To learn more about Passages, follow us on social media or visit us at passagesisrael.org. Until next time, we'll keep our finger on the pulse.